G'day guys, welcome back to Talk Talks. If you haven't watched the first video in this series talking about the ABS joining and apprentice smith levels, then I suggest you go and watch that one first. But today we're going to be covering the journeyman smith testing and what's required for that. Now, in order to become an ABS journeyman, you need to have been an apprentice for either 2 years and then a third year, so 2 years for your practical test and then a third year before you can do your judging, or 1 year for your practical test and 2 years for your judging if you can do an intro to blacksmithing class with the ABS at one of their accredited sites. But basically, you need to have some experience before you can go for your journeyman test, and therefore you should already know a lot of what's going on here, and the links to all of the materials that you can use to find out what you absolutely need for journeyman will be linked in the description below. You can go to the ABS website and they have PDFs downloadable for all of the information that you'll need. This is just going to be basically a rough overview from the perspective of someone who's doing the currently doing the journeyman smith testing phase, getting ready for everything. Step 1 of the journeyman smith testing has been filmed and shown all over the internet everywhere for a long time. If you haven't seen a journeyman smith testing video yet, I highly suggest you go and check it out. I actually have one where I did an unofficial testing, making one out of a leaf spring for a collaboration with my friend Alex Norton over at Valhalla Ironworks. So if you're interested in seeing that, it's in my channel, so check it out. But the basic rules are that it has to be a fully forged mono steel blade, cannot contain any laminate or Damascus in a journeyman smith blade or any of the judging blades as well, and I will reiterate this later, but it has to be mono steel and has to be forged. The whole point of the American Bladesmith Society is preserving the art of the forged blade. Stock removal, whilst a perfectly reasonable way to make knives, is not what the ABS is about. The whole point of bladesmithing is that we smith our blades. So with that in mind, you are forging a single monosteel blade of no greater than 10 inches blade length from tip to the beginning of the bolster or handle material or scale or whatever you've got. That is your length, not the tip to the ricasso, not the tip to the plunge cut. It is the tip to the beginning of the guard or bolster. The overall length cannot be longer than 15 inches. So obviously if you have a 10-inch blade, then you can have a 5-inch handle, whatever. You don't need a 10-inch handle and a 5-inch blade. You could do that, but it would give you significant disadvantages. We'll get into that in a minute. And finally, the maximum blade width or depth cannot be more than 2 inches. Those are the only 3 requirements for the journeyman smith testing. There is no handle quality requirements. There is no handle construction requirements. There is only a requirement on the blade itself. And these are all maximums, right? So you can go under these, you're just not allowed to go over these. And that's something to be very aware of when we go into the actual testing phase, because a lot of people get confused and think of it as like a set, like design limit. You need to make a 10-inch blade. You don't. You can make a 7-inch blade if you want to, but there are reasons why you don't. But with the practical test, you make this blade and then you would contact your mastersmith of choice, whether it's someone who's close to you, someone you could have easy access to, or perhaps it's just the person that you think you can get a hold of. Now, you're supposed to be able to do this at the mastersmith shop or at a shop that is, designated by that mastersmith. But there have been occasions that I know of that have to be approved by the ABS panel or board, that you can do this online over like a video Skype call. Now, I don't know the full details of how to get that done, but I imagine it involves contacting the ABS mastersmith that you want to get tested by, and then having that talk about getting that organized. So if you are in a remote location where doing a practical test at a mastersmith shop would be disastrously expensive, then that might be a route for you. So don't lose hope if you haven't managed to find a mastersmith in your area. It does have to be a mastersmith, however. It cannot be a journeyman smith. It can only be mastersmiths, and that mastersmith has to agree to doing the testing. It's not like they're just gonna drop everything to test you. if they're otherwise engaged. So you might not get the person you're looking for, but most of the time the mastersmiths are going to be amenable to testing you. For instance, I'm hoping to organize to go to Blade Symposium next year and meet Niels Vandenberg, who's a mastersmith, who's going to be visiting from South Africa, and he's going to do my practical testing for me there. So it's a little bit, you know, kind of all over the place, but we will get it done. And if that doesn't happen, then I have access to other mastersmiths that I can hopefully get a hold of. I know that there have been a couple of cases where people have done their practical test literally at Blade Show before they've done their judging. I do not advise that because if the practical test goes wrong, then you've spent all of your time and money to get to Blade Show to do your judging, just not to be able to get your judging done. So once you've forged this blade, and we're going to talk about the design, you'll then take it to the mastersmith shop and do the actual practical test. And we'll get into that after I talk about desirable design. And after I finished recording that, I decided to change my mind and actually go over what is required of that knife to do before we start talking about why design elements would help. Because I figured that would be an easy way to go about it. Anyway, anyone who's familiar with the Journeyman Smith testing would remember the cut, chop, bend test, or I call it the cut, chop, shave, bend test. Cut, chop, shave. Jesus, it's like a tongue twister. Say that 10 times fast. Now, it pays to remember that at no point during this testing, once the first cut has been made, you cannot touch the edge of the knife. You're not allowed to strop it on your hand or your leg. You're not allowed to do any form of refinement to the edge or adjustment of the edge after it has started testing. And it's not necessarily in this order. The bend is always last, but sometimes you'll do the chop before you do the cut. I have seen a lot of them where the cut is first, and I think that makes most sense, but that's not necessarily always the way it goes. So, with the cut, you have a 1-inch free-hanging manila or sisal rope that you have to cut 6 inches, or within 6 inches of the bottom of the rope. Now, normally you're required to provide this unless the mastersmith has some at hand, and normally mastersmiths will have that kind of stuff at their shop purely because they do testing like this regularly. So, if you don't have it, you can normally find access to it at a hardware store or something like that. It has to be manila or sisal, I think, in order for it to be, you know, relatively rigid to resist the cutting. You have to be able to cut with one clean swing. It's not a repeated thing. You can't hack at it. It has to be one clean swing through the rope and drop the rope on the ground. It doesn't have to be a perfectly clean, like, drop like a feather, but it does have to sever all of the fibers in the rope. Now, this is the only part of the test where the mastersmith may take over. You all get, I believe it's 2 or 3 attempts. I read the rules before I filmed this, but now I've forgotten all of the fine details and I don't have them in front of me. But you get 2 or 3 attempts to make the cut, and then a mastersmith will get an attempt at making the cut because it may be down to technique rather than about the geometry of the blade. At which point, if the mastersmith can then not make the cut, then the blade has failed, and that's it. You failed the practical testing. You haven't passed the first step. You failed the testing. You need to then reapply, I believe, after 12 months before you can do another practical test, I think. Again, read the documentation that's on the ABS website. This is why I've made sure to clarify. I am not a mastersmith, and I do not run this testing. So, provided you've managed to chop the 1-inch manila rope or 1-inch sisal rope, whatever it is that you've managed to cut free hanging within 6 inches of the bottom of the rope, then you will pass on to the next phase of the testing, which is to chop a 2x4, 2x4-inch pine piece of wood. Now, that can be provided by the mastersmith, but normally they're advised that you provide your own, and the clearer the grain, the better, because if you've got knots in it, then that's going to cause damage to your edge. The whole point of this is to provide enough aggressive abrasion to the edge to try and dull it. What they're trying to do is test your heat treat. The whole point of the Journeyman Smith testing is to test your heat treat. It's not about your blade so much. The first cut is about your geometry. The second cut is about heat treatment. It's about edge retention, right? So you chop the 2x4 twice, or 2 2x4s. It doesn't really matter either way. You're just cutting through 2x4 inches of pine with your knife. It can be affixed in a vise, I believe, but most people choose to do it free-handed. I don't know whether or not the one is better than the other in case of that. But once you've completed this step, that's why I add this third step that most people don't talk about, is the shave. It has to still shave arm hair in the location you were chopping with from your arm or your leg or somewhere else. And the whole reason for that is because if it isn't able to maintain its edge through two pieces of 2x4, then you're going to end up not passing that part of the test. You fail, and therefore you failed the practical testing, and you'll have to come back another time to do it again. So, chop the 2x4 twice. After you've cut the 1-inch hanging manila rope, you shave your arm hair, and it does shave. You have passed all of those processes. You get to the scary bit, which is the bend. Now, in the bend, you are allowed to have a crack no more than 1/3 of the width of the blade. So if your maximum width is 2 inches, then your maximum crack depth, I believe, is 0.66 of an inch, if I'm remembering correct. But that being said, if it does crack that much, there may be some annotations by the mastersmith on something like that, but it is allowable. With the bend test, there is no requirement on whether or not the blade bends back straight again. You're not required to have a blade that perfectly flexes back to true after bending to 90 degrees, because almost no steel will be able to do that. And so therefore, quite a few Journeyman Smith will choose to edge quench their Journeyman Smith knives. And if you go to Kyle Royer's Journey to Master series, where he does his Mastersmith testing knife, that's what he does. And that's what I did in my Journeyman Smith, quote unquote, unofficial Journeyman Smith testing with that leaf spring, is that I only edge quenched it. And the reason for that is because it reliably says that it's not going to crack more than 1/3 of the blade. It's a safety precaution. Some mastersmiths I have seen speak about it do not like that, but it is allowed as part of the rules. The bend test, you are required to bend the knife to 90 degrees. The ricasso has to be 90 degrees, not the handle. It has to be the ricasso, the unsharpened portion behind the blade, has to reach 90 degrees from the tip of the blade, which will be suspended in a vise 1/3 of the length of the blade. And this is why you don't want like a 5-inch blade on your Journeyman Smith test knife. A, it will take a lot longer to cut through the 2x4, and B, it will have to be like 2 inches inside that vise, and so therefore you've got a very short area to then flex. So the longer your blade, the more flexibility you're going to have, the more reliable you're going to be in the bend test without snapping. No one likes the idea of snapping a blade in the bend test. I have nightmares about it, so that's why it's suggested that you have a blade that is at the maximum cutting length, because you provide more length for the bend to curve over rather than having a sharp kink. So, provided you pass all of these, and before the bend, I may note that the mastersmith may choose to blunt the knife. That's, I think, an optional thing. I've seen Journeyman Smith bend knives that have been bent with the edge still on them. But yeah, it's entirely up to you guys whether or not that happens. But once you've passed all of these, the mastersmith will then sign the knife sometimes, and then sign the paperwork that you have passed that. And you have to take the knife and the paperwork provided that you've passed to Blade Show along with your 5 knives in order to get your accreditation. So, you're designing your knife for the Journeyman Smith practical test. What do you want to keep an eye on for your dimensions? Now, for me, I prefer to go for the maximum dimensions as I can. There is no requirement for a point on your Journeyman Smith test knife, and some of the Journeyman Smith test knives I've seen recently literally just had square points. They were just square at the tip. I prefer a knife to look like a knife, so mine are actually based around Kyle Royer's Mastersmith knives, which have this really nice upswept tip. Completely unnecessary, because the only thing they're worried about is the edge. So you could make a sheep's foot like this, or a Warncliffe, or you can make it square pointed, Bowie clip pointed, whatever. I do not suggest clip points because they provide a weak section of the blade that is much thinner than the rest of it, and especially because that's the area that's going to be clamped. If you've got a very weak section there, it can just lead to breakage, and we don't want that. We don't want breaking. No breaking. As far as the handle goes, this is where I differ from some of the Journeyman Smith knives that I've seen. A lot of the Journeyman Smith knives I've seen recently have had scales on a full tang. A lot of them have had tapered tangs, a lot more, kind of well-constructed handles, which is very nice. And, part of me believes that I should do that purely because it's the aesthetic and all that kind of thing. But from a practical perspective, you want a nice, robust, thick tang that is not going to bend, and paracord. There is no requirement for handle construction. There is no requirement for what is allowed as far as handle materials. So a paracord wrap will do you just as good as anything else, and with a nice thick 8mm tang, A, you're going to provide a little bit of extra weight for when you're chopping through that 2x4, and B, it is not going to flex at all, and you're not going to have the tang snap halfway through the bend, which I've heard scales crack in some of the Journeyman Smith testing I've seen. It is the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. And also, it provides a jarring motion. If you're imagining bending that blade, and then the tang scales pop off, and that tang moves, it jolts your hand a little bit, and that sharp motion could be enough to then send the blade snapping. So I'd much prefer a blade handle material that flexes. If I was going to choose a handle material, I'd choose something like G10 or micarta, something relatively robust, maybe even leather or rubber. Basically, you're making a competition chopper. You are making something designed for a cutting competition. It's just that you're not going into a cutting competition. You are being a bladesmith. So yeah, paracord, rubber, something flexible, something that's not going to snap or break, and something that is going to be relatively comfortable to hold whilst chopping through a 2x4 and isn't going to slip out of your grip. I highly suggest having a lanyard hole in your handle, or at least leaving a piece of the paracord loose so that you can have a lanyard, because having that extra security means that you're not going to have the knife go flying off into the distance if you accidentally lose grip of it because you're really nervous when you're chopping a 2x4 or swinging it at a piece of manila rope. When it comes to the blade, they give you a maximum of 10 inches from the handle material to the tip. So obviously you want the maximum length because, again, you're providing that extra length for it to flex. But in doing so, you also want to have a nice distal taper. So having a nice thick tang like 8mm, you can then have a really nice sharp distal taper down to your point, which can be like 2mm, and that provides a lot of compound flex rather than direct flex. If you have a straight parallel walled blade, then the flex will happen in the middle of between where the blade is pinioned and your bending apparatus, whether that be a cheetah bar or whether you're just hanging onto the handle yourself. And that means that there's going to be a stress point right in the middle between those two. Whereas if you provide a nice distal taper in your blade, it will flex across the whole length and then eventually flex more towards the thinner side in the vise. But that's going to leave it more like a fishing rod. It's going to flex and then return as true rather than bending in the middle and breaking. Because any real stress rises is going to be a serious problem. Speaking of stress risers, hand sand your practical test knives. I know that it seems like a lot of work for something that you're going to break anyway, but having vertical grinder marks on your blade doing this, it's just that extra little bit of work that you can do to make sure that that is not going to break. Any little stress riser in this thing can cause it to snap. I recently made a blade for my birthday sword that had a little nick in it from a plasma cutter, and that caused it to snap like it was glass, even though it was really well heat treated. I tested it afterwards. So make sure that you hand sand your practical test knives. It also just looks nice. And as far as geometry goes, you want a full flat grind, or a full flat grind with a minor apple seed towards the edge, what's called the ABS grind, which basically is full flat most of the length and then just curls in at the last second to create a little bit more robust of an edge and provide some really nice cutting geometry. You want it nice and thin because remember, you've got to cleave through that 2x4 and you've also got to cleave through that manila rope, and the better the geometry, the better it's going to cut. The faster you cut through the 2x4, the less impact on your edge. So if you have a really light blade that's really kind of, feathery and all that kind of stuff, it'll bend really well, but it's also going to take half an hour to chop through your 2x4, and that means that you're going to be whacking on it a lot more, which means a lot more abrasion on your edge. So having a slightly heavier blade, whilst yes, it provides more resistance in the bend, which means that there's more chance of it breaking, you've got less abrasion on your edge. And from experience, as long as you've got a really decent distal taper, it doesn't matter if this area here is 10mm. As long as the distal taper is good over those 10 inches, then you're going to have perfect amount of flex. The test blade that I made in the leaf spring video, the spine was 8.5mm wide, which is almost 3/8 of an inch. So you're going to be fine. But those are the notes that I would make for making a Journeyman Smith testing knife. There are other videos out there, and there are forum posts and all kinds of recommendations, and you can speak to a Journeyman Smith or a Master Smith to get better for clarification on what you would do. This is just what I would do. As far as steel requirements, I've had a lot of people ask me what steel I would use. I've used 5160 and 80CRV2 to make blades for testing. I believe they're a little bit better because they provide a lot of flex, but edge retention as well. 80CRV2 would probably be my favorite choice of all of them, but 1084, 75, and 60 will work. Obviously, when you do your Master Smith bend test, you're normally using 1084 and 15N20, which we'll get into in the next video. But that amount of the eutectoid steels and lower, so that medium carbon and lower, are perfect for this kind of thing, and they will normally hold up, although I definitely would recommend edge quenching those rather than full quenching them. You could full quench your 80CRV2 and 5160 and just back temper the blades and probably get away with it, but you might not get away with that with a 1084. But yeah, so that's the requirements for your practical test knife. Again, make sure you do your own research a little bit and talk to some Master Smiths and Journeyman Smiths. Talk to the Master Smith you're going to be tested by, because they might be able to give you some advice before you get out there and fail the test, because no one wants to do that. No one wants to see it. The Master Smith isn't there to make sure that you fail. They're there to try and help you succeed. So make sure you're talking to them before you actually do your test. So upon rereading the rules before I got to this point, I realized that you actually have 3 years from passing the practical test in order to do your judging. So even if you pass the practical test 1 year and can't get to the blade show until 2 years later, you will still be able to do your judging. If you do not do the judging before those 3 years have elapsed, then you will have to redo your practical test. If you fail the practical test, you will have 6 months before you can reapply, and you cannot do the judging. So during that period, the Master Smith that tested you is advised to suggest extra, work for you to do to improve your work before you retake your practical test. So just clarifying here, and hopefully people will see that before they start angrily commenting that I got it wrong. I'm learning as I go. Anyway, for the judging, you are required to make 5 knives, and some will say actually 6, but the 6th is your practical test knife. That has to come with you to the show, along with the paperwork that you passed with the signature of the Master Smith judge that judged you. Now, these 5 knives cannot contain Damascus of any kind. Not guards, not pommel nuts, nothing. None of the blade may be Damascus or laminate steel. Has to be mono steel. The reason for that is because they're trying to get away from people covering up their mistakes with cool materials, right? So Damascus is, people go, oh, I made Damascus, therefore I passed the Journeyman. No. So mono steel only, and all of the fittings have to be of a mono steel or mono brass fitting. Words are failing me right now. But either way, all of the fittings have to be mono steel, or the blade has to be mono steel as well. You're not allowed Damascus, you're not allowed folders. The Journeyman Smith testing, you are not allowed to make a folder for the testing. I believe in Master Smith testing you are allowed, and that is in the paperwork. And again, I will highly suggest you go read the paperwork yourself. It is all there on the Wavy Episode website. But the folders are not allowed. It's purely because it's an extra level of complexity, and they're trying to judge your capability based on the lower level of capability compared to Master Smith. Master Smith, you're supposed to be superlative. Now, when it comes to your judging, they do suggest that you construct your knives differently. So all 5 knives constructed slightly differently. That is not a requirement, but it is a suggestion. All of the finishes should be clean and crisp and flat. There should be no gaps in anything, whether it be the fit up to from the guard to the blade, whether it be the fit up from the scales to the tang, if you're doing a full tang, or the handle block to the guard. There should be no gaps. And when I say no gaps, I mean they are going to be looking at these through optivisors. They're going to be looking at these through magnification. So if you don't have magnification in your shop and you are not capable of, exacting tolerances like that, then you need to practice your tolerances. You need to practice your guard fits. You need to practice your scale fits, getting things flat. I have videos on getting things flat, and making sure that you're actually doing the absolute best you can, because these are supposed to be representative of your best work. These are supposed to be the work that you would do if the king or queen or whatever asked you to make a knife. This is what we're asking you to do. And so therefore, when it comes to making your JS knives, you want them to be scratch-free, you want them to have no J-hooks, everything nice and finished. You are allowed buffed finishes, but hand-sanded finishes tend to be very popular. And the grit requirements are nothing. There is no other requirement other than they have to be clean. If you go on Sharp by Coop, Cooper, who does a lot of the photography for the ABS and a lot of the photography for knife makers around the world, he's probably one of the best that I've seen. You will see JS test knife sets, and go and look at all of those, because there are hundreds of pieces to show you exactly what they're asking for. And you can do it in your own style. You can go wild and out there and all kinds of designs. Jackson Rumble, who's an Australian bladesmith who passed his JS a couple of years back, he did an integral keyhole dagger for one of his pieces, which was completely unnecessary, but won him the Joe Kiesler Award. So you can go out there, or you can go very simple. There are quite a few Journeyman Smith people who have gone through and won and got their Journeyman Smith rating with very simple knives. It's all down to your level of ability and your level of creativity. But at the end of the day, cleanliness is the most important thing. Cleanliness and fit up. They do stress the design has to be good, and I have an entire playlist of Chalk Talks that talks about knife design and getting evenly balanced designs and stuff like that. You don't want too much handle or too much blade. And having a nice flowing design with all the lines go into each other really well is going to help you with passing your Journeyman Smith judging. Now, I haven't gone through my Journeyman Smith judging. I am not a Master Smith who's done Journeyman Smith judging. And I highly suggest you talk to Master Smiths, which I have done on many an occasion, about what they're looking for. Because you've got to remember that it's down to the panel of 7 Master Smith judges who are going to be looking at your work to decide whether or not it is worth passing your grade onto Journeyman. If you have one knife that fails, you can fail your Journeyman Smith. It's not a given thing, but if you have one egregious mistake, then you will fail. And they will fail you. That's part of the whole deal. They are fairly stringent on their requirements for that kind of thing, because holding the JS rating is to mean that you have held some esteem in the ABS community. And so if you're not giving your best, they're not going to give you that rating. With Master Smith judging, it's a next level, and we'll talk about that in the next video. But suffice it to say, when you're doing your judging knives, make them the best knives you've ever made, and if you are a little bit doubtful of the fact that they're not the best knives that you've ever made, then throw it away and start again, or sell it and start another one. Because at the end of the day, this is an opportunity that doesn't come very often, and obviously a lot of us who are coming from internationally, it's going to be a lot of money to get to the Blade Show. You don't want to waste that opportunity. You don't want to waste that chance. So make sure you're doing it right. Check out every other Journeyman Smith set that you've ever seen. Go to Sharp by Coop's page. There are a couple of recommendation pieces on the ABS website as well, I believe, in the gallery, so check those out if you're interested. But at the end of the day, do your absolute best and you'll be fine. As long as you pass the practical test, the Journeyman Smith judging test is literally the hardest test, is sitting down and waiting for the judges to have their decision. I'm not looking forward to that next year. But with that being said, if you've passed all of those and you pass that area, then you will be given your Journeyman Smith rating. You will be a JS, and you'll be able to put that on your name. I'm not sure of the full ramifications of becoming a JS yet, but as far as I'm aware, you'll be able to use JS stamps on your work, and you'll be able to tout yourself as a JS of the ABS, which means that you've passed the testing, which means that you've proved yourself to be a capable knife maker in the eyes of the ABS, and then you will become a Master Smith 2 years later when you do your Master Smith testing, which is something we'll discuss in the next video. Hope you enjoyed this one, guys. If you're interested in more like this, then please hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon to be notified of when I upload new videos. I would like to say a huge thank you to my patrons who make this kind of content available, and I actually started this series based on a comment from one of my patrons. So if you're interested in helping push me in the direction of something you want me to talk about, then leave a comment down below, or maybe join my Patreon and I'll take you more seriously. I'm just kidding. But seriously, if you want to support my channel, the links to my Patreon will be down in the description below. It'll also be in the tags up here and the end card at the end of the video. I hope you have a fantastic week. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. And if you do, make sure you get it on film and send it to me so I can laugh at your mistakes. And I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.